Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 2. And Monday morning, 11 a.m. show. It's something I haven't done for a little while. And I'm glad to get back with you. And it is my hope to continue with our Monday morning, 11 a.m. shows so that I can have time to read. I've had so much success with interviews of really fascinating people that I noticed I hadn't read any books in the last month, and so I'm going to get back to it today, right now, with a book that really fits with my research studies right now in a kind of interesting broad way. Um, Good morning, Robert. Good morning, Corky. And good morning, everybody. Let's see. So, you know, Yankee Doodle, right? Um, Live free or die, sic semper tyrannis, and give me liberty or give me death. Well, where did all that come from? Where did the revolution come from? Hello, all of a sudden. Good to have you on deck. Um, where did the ideas and how did the networks get formed that enabled us to have a successful revolution? At least we think it was successful, right? We claim it was successful. Yes, we're still saying we are free. It's our government. We, the people, are the only source of government power. And that means you can't take our government away from us. We'll just change the government if you guys screw up to bad enough. And you're screwing up pretty bad, by the way, if any of you government folks are listening. I can't imagine, you know, how the country holds together with such blatant corruption everywhere. But, it's like a house of cards, right? So I'm not going to pull the cards out. Don't worry about me. I just want to let everybody know how we got here. Who was Benjamin Franklin? Who indeed was Benjamin Franklin? Well, I've always had ideas about Benjamin Franklin, good and bad. Um, Benjamin Franklin, okay, here's thank you. And Aaron is doing our production this morning. And thank you so much, Aaron. Um, do appreciate everybody at Neighborhood News Studio. And uh, we are glad to share on Neighborhood News along with all our McDuff material is certainly part of all one big effort, which we call the Screaming Ospreys. Benjamin Franklin was a founding father and a polymath. Oh, inventor, scientist, printer, politician, Freemason, and diplomat. Well, all of those are good except for that last. What was that? Freemason? Is that good? Um, I don't know. Was that good or bad? Oh, I see my little book stand is in the view. Sorry. Um, that's part of the big question. David Underdown, thank you so much for being with us. Corky says alchemist. Um, Franklin helped draft the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, and he negotiated the 1783 Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War. Scientific pursuits included investigations into electricity, mathematics, and map making. A writer known for his wit and wisdom, Franklin also published Poor Richard's Almanac, invented bifocal glasses, and organized the first successful American lending library. Um, that's enough to bring back to us our impressions from. I guess it was about seventh grade that we started getting a little bit of history coming into our educations, and he was one of the main figures you learned about because of Poor Richard's Almanac and all the wise things. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Isn't that interesting to think about that in contradiction to uh, the basic Christianity of the Puritans of the time? Why is wealth a good thing? Did Benjamin Franklin pick up the idea that wealth is a good thing from Freemasons? Where did he get that idea? Well, it's a witty saying, and maybe it's not all that meaningful, but it raises the issue of what is the real purpose of wealth in a free society, based on liberty. How much wealth can be in the hands of the few for the rest of us to maintain our liberty? Question of the centuries. Wealth may not be the best thing in the world for a democracy. That's my bottom line. I think there was some wisdom when we had a really progressive income tax, so that when you started making, millions and millions and millions of dollars a year, that your income tax went up into the 90%. And that kind of discouraged you from wanting to make a lot more money, wouldn't it? Unless you've turned the whole system into a speculative poker game, which is, you know, always won by the guy that has the deepest pockets that can stay in the game longest, or gal, excuse me, player. You think they have little cards in front of their names to say that them/we, or you know, I/me. Um, no, I decry the abuse of the English language and the attempt to change it into something that denies the sexuality that's inherent in all humanity. Nope. All right. Wow. I didn't mean to start on a rant this morning, but let's get over to, because what reason that I asked you to think about, who is he? Because I guess the idea here is to learn a new side, or a new Benjamin Franklin that makes a lot more sense historically and fits in with the theme of this book, is that from the original Puritans' intention of creating a new world society, a society based upon uh, God's law, and to be completely free from old Europe. That tradition has been traced by this book, and we're now into page 365. H. Graham Lowry did a fantastic service to all of us, and look, you can get it for only $10 on Kindle. Fabulous. So let's keep going, and I remind everyone that these are all on my playlist on both BitChute and on YouTube. So if you wanted to start from the beginning, you can just hit the beginning of the playlist and go through it that way, because it's getting pretty long. We're on 21 now. Okay. Well, we've just been talking about, and it's been a couple of months, so maybe a little bit of a review, that Benjamin Franklin was working for one of the Mathers in the in the 1720s. Um, and that was at a time when the Mathers were under pressure by you know, the pro-British party, the speculative party, same as we have now. Only the speculators are totally in power in our country right now. But this is the same principle of, are we here to build a new world country, a new country, a country based upon the will of the people, or not? Are we still going to play financial games with old piles of money from Europe? And that's what we've gotten stuck into right now is this absence of freedom caused by financial entanglements. Um, the newspaper of the day is the New England Current, and it's important because that's where Mather is publishing some of his writings. And so the point is that there's a transition from the Mathers to Franklin that is highlighted here in this chapter of how the nation was won that people just don't know about. Where shall I start? Ironically, one of Benjamin Franklin's later agents in Ireland had to flee to the United States to escape arrest for reprinting Swift's A Modest Proposal half a century after Swift's death. You remember A Modest Proposal? We read from it the modest proposal that the Irish, in order to relieve the famine, should simply collect the poor children and find ways to prepare them for dinner, not to get them ready for dinner, but to make them dinner. The agent was Matthew Carey, Republican economist in his own right and the father of Henry Carey. Now, if you've been following me with the LaRouche and Schiller people at all, you know who Henry Carey is. Henry Carey is the author uh, of what's called the American System, but he was a uh, economist that showed how to build the economy from the inside. And that is what is referred to now as the American system. So, isn't this an interesting connection between um, Benjamin Franklin, who has an agent in Ireland who gets charged with the crime of reprinting A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, which had been written 50 years earlier? And that agent was Matthew Carey, the Republican economist who was the father of Henry Carey. Now that is tying things together that people just would never see without scholarship and the patience and the time to actually sit down and write this text. So bravo to Graham Lowry and to the EIR folks who printed it. Executive Intelligence Review um, printed in, well, this one's 2018. The agent was Matthew Carey, Republican economist in his own right and the father of Henry Carey, the leading developer of American system economics during the period of Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. Matthew Carey's crime against the government of George III was to make available again Swift's devastating indictment of British genocide against Ireland, in which he anonymously offered a scheme for breeding babies for human consumption as a solution for Ireland's poverty and misery. The Whig literary wits, in quotes, Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, were models emulated by the quote, right to die propagandists at the New England Current. Addison and Steele were also the leading figures churning out sophisticated Whig propaganda for The Spectator from 1711 to 1714, in opposition to Swift's behind the scenes reorganization of the policies and the cabinet of Queen Anne's government. The Current's staff cribbed regularly from The Spectator's old issues, but never from Swift. Now, this gives me another opportunity to to go off on a tangent, and I'm going to take it once again. Um, Give me a weekend off, and my brain starts working. Uh, Joseph Addison, famous essayist, and Richard Steele published The Spectator and another publication called The Tatler, in which they presented essays or vignettes from life, uh, kind of giving a broad sense of belonging to the common people who are working their way into the merchant system, uh, giving them a sense that they're part of a greater society, as opposed to the absolute division between nobility and serfs that was the the time honored cultural division in Europe and particularly in England. Now the oligarchs, the people behind George the First, George the Second, George the Third, or the horizontal rulers in Sean Ross's concept, where it's the broader base nobility and not just the actual line of monarchy. That the monarchs are the vertical and the broad nobility, meaning the Knights Templar and the Freemasons, etc. These are the structures that keep these people together, and together they rule. Um, and as Sean Ross is pointing out now, which I think is just fascinating if you follow his channel, that we've experienced, starting in England, the joinder of the monarch and the oligarchs, so that they're kind of like the Red Cross on St. John's, on St. George's flag, the flag of England. Well, they're together, and they work together against the rest of us, so that now this is the product of what Addison and Steele were doing, was to bring people into the idea that, hey, yeah, we're part of this, but it's all a sham, because the fact is that it was Jonathan Swift that was the leader of the opposing side, where the Jonathan Swift side is saying, hey, people are starving. You're killing people. This is a genocide. And people like Addison are just drawing, it's it's kind of like the crap we see on television, just something for people to read, that gives them the idea that they're part of the greater society just because they work and submit, take the king's coin or whatever you want to call it. So the point I was going to make is that Joseph Addison was the direct first cousin of John Addison, who was the founder of Oxon Hill Manor. And of course, Oxon Hill Manor, as those of you who've been with me and George since we started 4 years ago, is the place where uh, the National Harbor is now. There's still the mansion there, the Sumner Wells Mansion, called Oxon Hill Manor, which we visited a number of times. And Oxon Hill is the name of the community where McDuff uh, first bought a house and started to raise his family. So all of this now ties my life into, through the Oxon Hill Manor, back into this history, to the Addison family, and across the Atlantic into northern England, where the Addisons uh, were merchants. Um, I won't try to tell the whole Addison story now, but I do want to share it with you sometime. Yes, and as a matter of fact, my first wedding was in that very building, Oxon Hill Manor. Um, so, yeah, that's the place. Okay, so I just wanted to tie that together. Benjamin Franklin began his undercover contributions to the current as Silence Dogwood. No, Dogood. Silence Dogood is his pen name in April 1722. Surviving texts of his autobiography omit any references to the controversy then raging or the content of the pieces he wrote. What is reported is that since he knew, quote, that my brother would object to printing anything in his paper if he knew it to be mine, I contrived to disguise my hand. And writing an anonymous paper, I put it at night under the door of the printing house. It was found in the morning and communicated to his writing friends when they called in as usual. For his literary persona of Silence Dogwood, I'm sorry, I did it again, Silence Dogood, Franklin introduced the modest widow of a country minister seeking to comprehend the strange new mores and fashions of Boston. Isn't that interesting how I just described Addison and Steele doing that type of thing in London? While, while offering advice and admonitions from one not yet corrupted. His fictional advocate began by noting that nowadays readers will not accept an author without knowing who or what the author of it is, his circumstances and manner of living, and whether he be a scholar or a leather apron man. That last qualification referring to an ongoing war between the Mathers and those tradesmen like James Franklin under the sway of the quote anti-inoculators unquote and Elisha Cook. Well, for anti-inoculators, how could you have more timely reference to something that happened um, exactly 300 years ago? Exactly 300 years ago in Boston, they had a smallpox epidemic. And as we read in the previous chapters, there was a movement of anti-vaxxers back then. And the case was made that the vaccine works and needs to be taken. These anti inoculators of that day were led by a tradesman named James Franklin and Elisha Cook, who was one of the speculators. Hey, that's great. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, leather apron man to me sounds like a Freemason. That's what I think that reference is. But then this is 1722, and Freemasonry, I think, is really initiated it just a few years earlier, like 1714, if I recall, in England. Somebody will put that in the chat. The literary device with which Franklin introduced Silence Do Good, was precisely chosen to fool Brother James and his writing friends. The very first piece The Spectator published, written by Joseph Addison to launch that paper in 1711, began with the sentence, quote, I have observed that a reader seldom peruses a book with pleasure till he knows whether the writer of it be black or a fair man, of a mild or choleric disposition, married or a bachelor, with other particulars of the like nature that conduce very much to the right understanding of an author, unquote. Franklin had just forged his entry into the Current's, quote, Hellfire Club, unquote, and the ruse worked. Franklin's autobiography reports that when the Current's scribblers arrived the next day and discovered his, quote, letter, Quote, they read it, commented on it in my hearing, and I had the exquisite pleasure of finding it met with their approbation, and that in their different guesses at the author, none were named but men of some character among us for learning and ingenuity. I suppose now that I was rather lucky in my judges, and that perhaps they were not really so very good as I then believed them to be. Unquote. Certainly, they were not as clever as he might have imagined them. The account in the autobiography adds that he, quote, wrote and sent in the same way several other pieces which were equally approved, and I kept my secret until my small fund of cents for such performances were pretty well exhausted, when he revealed his authorship. In his dealings with his brother James, the disclosure occasioned, quote, one of the differences we began to have about this time. In the same paragraph, Franklin's autobiography adds that his disputes with James were often brought before our father, and the judgment was generally in my favor. James frequently beat him nonetheless, and the report continues. I fancy his harsh and tyrannical treatment of me might be a means of impressing me with that aversion to arbitrary power that has stuck to me through my whole life. Looking beyond this family feud to the Silence Do-Good papers themselves, the case for Benjamin Franklin's and his father's adherence to the Mathers becomes conclusive. Franklin's next two pieces continued mimicking the Spectator's merely, quote, literary show of abstract moralizing in the, quote, sophisticated Whig manner. This author is capturing it very, very well. That's exactly the way I would have, if I were taxed on describing the writing of Addison, because I've studied it because I'm fascinated with anything to do with Oxenale Manor. So anyway, back to the book. With each printing of the latest witticisms of the, quote, mysterious woman, whose Silence Do-Good is a female, I guess, the wags of Hall's Tavern and the enlightened would be Anglicans dominating Harvard College, clucked approvingly in their respective fashions. The Harvard problem was especially troublesome to Cotton Mather. Increase Mather had battled to maintain the college's Republican traditions even during the Andros dictatorship, and Cotton knew all too well the depths of miseducation reached since his father's ouster as president and the takeover of Harvard after 1700 by the Cook machine and its merchant backers. Well, now we see where Harvard went wrong. It was back in 1717. Boycotting Harvard's commencement day in 1717, Cotton Mather prayed that, quote, our college, which is on many accounts in a very neglected and unhappy condition, and has been betrayed by vile practices, may be restored unto better circumstances, unquote. By the early 1720s, he feared outright Anglican usurpation of the institution. Yeah, and isn't, I mean, when you think about the function, this is me again, think about the function of the Anglican Church in supporting institutions like Columbia, Harvard, really the the intimacy of that institution with the Wall Street, the famous um, uh, Anglican Church and Episcopal Church in New York, which is High Church Anglican. And you say, well, where did all that come from? Well, here it is, right here, 1717, 1718. His concern was well founded in 1722, even as Benjamin Franklin continued his Silence Do-Good papers in the Courant. An Anglican coup surfaced at Yale. the Connecticut College at New Haven, founded in 1706, which the Mathers had hoped might outflank the subversion of Harvard. Okay, so there goes Yale, right there, 1722. Franklin's fourth do-good essay appeared April 16th, 1722, after considerable public gossip and speculation had developed concerning the identity of the apparent new ally of the current's crusade against the Mathers and their ministerial allies. Franklin's authorship remained unknown to the current, and he ventured now for the first time into specific controversies of the day. Modern historians actually cite this particular do good letter as evidence of Franklin's hostility toward the Mathers. In it, modest widow, the modest widow, had a conversation with one Claricus during a stroll in the country on a warm, sunny afternoon. Resting a while under a tree, she dozes off and has a dream about a visit to the, quote, Temple of Learning, where she discovers too many, quote, dunces and blockheads and too much catering to wealth. To the current's clever followers, Mrs. Dogood was commencing an attack on Harvard College and those nasty Mathers, that referring to Claricus. The Cook machine, just as it had whipped up popular opinion against Cotton Mather's life-saving inoculations for smallpox, was then attacking Harvard and education in general as a wasteful extravagance for the rich. Under Mather's enemy John Leverett, brother-in-law of Elisha Cook Sr., the college had certainly become vulnerable to such charges. Benjamin Franklin took note of Harvard's fate, since it had fallen into enemy hands. During Silence Dogood's dream of her visit to the Temple of Learning, quote unquote, she discovers a magnificent throne in the great hall. On the top of it sat Learning in an awful state. She was apparelled wholly in black and surrounded on almost every side with innumerable volumes in all languages. Following this image of benighted learning, swamped by incoherence, Franklin springs the trap. Quote, she seemed very busily employed in writing something on a half sheet of a paper, and upon inquiry I understood she was preparing a paper called, quote, the New England Current, unquote. Thus, he identifies Leverett's Aristotelian modernist regime at Harvard as the intellectual ally of the current war against science. Franklin further characterizes the decay of the college in a passage reminiscent of Swift's Battle of the Books. On Learning's left hand were seated several antique figures with their faces veiled. I was considerably puzzled to guess who they were until one informed me, who stood beside me, that those figures on her left hand were Latin, Greek, Hebrew, etc., and that they were very much reserved and seldom or never unveiled their faces here. I then inquired of him what could be the reason why they continued veiled in this place especially. He pointed to the foot of the throne where I saw idleness attended with ignorance, and these, he informed me, were they who first veiled them and still kept them so. For what remained of Harvard's role in educating the ministry, Dogood adds her impressions of this temple of theology as well, reporting that there, quote, I saw nothing worth mentioning except the ambitious and fraudulent contrivances of Plagius, who, notwithstanding he had been severely reprehended for such practices before, was diligently transcribing some eloquent paragraphs out of Tillotson's works, etc., to embellish his own. When Dogood awakens from her dream, she relates it to Claricus with all its particulars, and he, without much study, presently interpreted it, assuring me that it was a lively representation of Harvard College, etc. Thus, Franklin's supposed diatribe against Mather is in fact a dialogue between the two men, developing the same arguments that Claricus, that is, Cotton Mather, had put forth himself. In targeting the fraudulent contrivances of Pelagius from the works of Anglican Archbishop Tillotson, Franklin again focused on the same current of philosophical corruption at Harvard, which Mather had been attacking for years, as well as on the liberal Anglican patrons of the quote, anti inoculators themselves. So I don't know if I'm just particularly loquacious this morning. I just wanted to make another comment. Did, if you follow the church, the let's just say that from the Puritans up until now, and I can't say I have this fresh in my mind, but I've done it in the past, and I've traced this, these denominations and things historically. Well, during the 1700s, the Anglican Church split between the high church Anglicans and the low church Anglicans. It had a split before that. I don't want to try to do the whole history, but let's just identify that there are two different versions mainly of the Anglican Church, and it's the high ones, which is very similar to Catholic and has a lot of ceremony, ceremony, some ceremony, but for ceremony. Well, that's King Henry V's problem, is that um, if it weren't for ceremony, he wouldn't have to be a king. But that's a different play entirely. The ceremonies are part of power, of the appearance of power. And that appearance of power goes along with the monarchy and the nobility and the other societies like the Garter and the Knights of the Bath and the Freemasons, right? So all of that stuff is uh, um, it's mutually beneficial to all of these different levels of this oligarchical slash monarchical society that tends to want to speculate on other people's money. And to see that that was what was happening at Harvard College back in the 1720s is to say, wow, now we can understand that that same stress between high church and low church is expressed right here this early and still continues to this day, in which I don't speak for the Anglican Church, but I do think that most of the low church has died out, fallen victim to the better financed, more powerful high church. The low church is more of a almost closer to a Baptist idea of having a personal relationship with God. But I don't want to talk about that right now. I will get myself in trouble for sure. Okay, so without any offense to anyone, I just wanted to throw that in there because it's part of the history that we have to understand. You can't follow America without knowing what's a Methodist, what's a Baptist, what's an Episcopal. You got to study that. The staff of the Current, whatever their misgivings concerning the actual identity of Silence Dogood, was stuck with a celebrated columnist who might be digging their own graves. Jonathan Swift's Isaac Bickerstaff, the fictitious astrologer who convinced the public of the death of his quite living rival John Partridge, would have appreciated the twist of friend revealed as foe. As to the origin and intention of Franklin's choice of pseudonym, the current staff may have overlooked a clue in the very title of the latest work Cotton Mather had published in Boston, quote, Silentarius, printed in the fall of 1721 at the height of the smallpox epidemic. The book was printed on the occasion of the death of his daughter from other causes with the subtitle, quote, A Brief Essay on the Holy Silence and Godly Patience That Sad Things Are to Be Entertained Withal. Mather's, quote, hellfire, unquote, antagonists were undoubtedly too benighted to detect another irony in Mather's January 15th address to the ministers on the subversion of his opportunities to do good before the leaders of many of his civic organizations, which included in their ranks Benjamin Franklin's father, Josiah. He had declared, quote, and though I could easily have confuted the slanders and clamors, I have rather borne them with silence, unquote. Having thrown the enemy camp into sufficient disarray to make it vulnerable, Mather's circle now moved in to eliminate its main propaganda weapon. First, Mather arranged for some further cover for Silence Dogood, whose political loyalties the Current could not expose without making itself the laughingstock of Boston for having so warmly embraced the modest widow. In the Boston Gazette of May 28th, Mather's son Samuel replied to Dogood's, quote, attack on the temples of learning and theology without disputing any of its substance. Under the pseudonym John Harvard, Samuel Mather addressed not Dogood but the Current's own sources of inspiration. Sir, desire Current to no more put upon Plagius for fear of hurting himself. Mather's John Harvard proceeded to demonstrate that most of the Current's literary pieces were plagiarized from old issues of The Spectator, The Guardian, and The Tatler, all produced by Whig propagandists who had become enemies of Jonathan Swift. Wow, case closed, huh? If you followed that, then you see that our author Graham Lowry has almost put himself into the mind of Benjamin Franklin eh, by studying in detail, the Mathers, this Boston newspaper called the New England Current. And here, the mysterious Hellfire Club that I'm sure that you've probably heard of if you've ever looked into Benjamin Franklin appears to be the other side and not Franklin, but the the merchants, the speculators. So more will be revealed. We'll learn more, I'm sure, in this chapter. Let's check the time because I can't go. All right, we're good. As Silence Dogood, Franklin wrote 14 letters in all from April to October 1722. In the face of the Current's Hellfire campaign, they were his own essays to do good. He had warned in his third, still as the undiscovered author, quote, that I shall now take up a resolution to do for the future all that lies in my way for the service of my countrymen, unquote. Franklin added, I have from my youth been indefatigably studious to gain and treasure up in my mind all useful and desirable knowledge, especially such as tends to improve the mind and enlarge the understanding, unquote. The anonymous Silence Dogood had been warmly received by the Hall's Tavern plotters thus far. Franklin concluded this letter, quote, I think I have now finished the foundation, and I intend in my next to begin raising the building, unquote. His next, of course, was his blast against the Current's patrons in the corrupted Temple of Learning. Following that letter, Silence Dogood put forth the necessity of greater education for women as indispensable to ending the folly and vanity in relations between the sexes and to developing a republican citizenry. For this piece, and more extensively for a later one on an insurance plan for widows, Franklin quoted from Daniel Defoe's An Essay on Projects, published in London in 1697 in support of the economic development program offered by Robert Harley in opposition to the monetarist swindle imposed by Montague and Marlborough's Bank of England. It's interesting to read the name Montague and then realize that that same name comes up in the financing of World War II with Montague Norman and his ties to Hitler. Fascinating stuff. Montague. Mhm. Of course, it must be Italian, right? From Shakespeare. Defoe was also a correspondent of Cotton Mather and is cited as such in Mather's diary. Silence Dogood's treatment of Defoe included an endorsement for the reforming societies proposed in Mather's Essays to Do Good, which Franklin himself was to organize in Philadelphia. Quote, I would leave this to the consideration of all who are concerned for their own or their neighbor's temporal happiness, and I am humbly of opinion that the country is ripe for many such friendly societies, whether whereby every man might help another without any disservice to himself. Unquote. Cotton Mather's political heir was coming into his own. The evidence concerning Franklin's first counterintelligence mission has been presented here in detail for two essential reasons. First, to establish that counterintelligence work was a central feature of his career from the outset. Isn't that cool? That he's calling what we just identified. To me, it looked like a stealth campaign, but he's using our author is using the term counterintelligence. Fascinating, because that, of course, was my dad's specialty at the FBI. Second, to demonstrate that his political career was a continuation of New England's commitment from its founding to a sovereign republic. John Winthrop's quote, City upon a Hill, a model of freedom for the world. From the moment Charles II in 1684 voided the Winthrop Charter upon which New England's liberty had been built, the preparations for the American Revolution had begun. In 1689, only 6 years after Benjamin Franklin's father Josiah brought his family to Massachusetts, Increase Mather from London and Cotton Mather in Boston directed the armed overthrow of Royal Governor Edmund Andros by Massachusetts militiamen and proclaimed again a New England republic. The rebellion was a temporary blocking action against the expected new tyrannies of William of Orange, the Dutch prince who had just overthrown James II and seized the throne of England. In New England, the dates of decisive events were well remembered. When Mather protege Benjamin Franklin, under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac in Philadelphia in 1733, he left a calling card perhaps unnoticed since his lifetime. On the almanac's final page, Franklin provided a quote catalog of the principal kings and princes in Europe with the time of their births and ages. Below a bar line at the end of the list, Franklin printed the birth date of quote Poor Richard, an American prince without subjects, unquote. The birthday given is October 23rd, 1684, the precise date on which Charles II revoked the Massachusetts Charter. And I think that's where I'll leave it. It's now 8 minutes to noon, and I know our good friends Aaron and Andy need to get ready for a George Webb noon show. So I will leave it there for now. But thanks for being with me. I find this history it's hard, right? It's not easy. Yeah. Hey, Professor Hamamoto's here. Great. Yeah, we're going to have to research that. The Capulets and the Montagues, of course, and are they part of the black nobility? Yeah. It's just there's no end to it. You can just keep on researching, can't you? And it's fun, and you know, it's helpful. Every bit of help of research that some one person does, if you share it, then it might be helping 1,000 people or even more than that. All right, guys, I'm going to leave it here. Thanks very much for being with me. And tonight I'll do a minefields at 8 p.m. Eastern time.